Destiny is a lie. Destiny is justification for atrocity. It is the means by which murderers armor themselves against reprimand. It is a word intended to stand in place of ethics, denying all moral context. What's up, BookTube? I have finally had the time to sit down and record my Midnight Tides in-depth review. I'm sorry that this didn't come out earlier. I've just been very busy and I've had very little time to record, and I've read some books in between, so I apologize for that. But I've finally had time to sit down and do my review. So here it is, my in-depth review for Midnight Tides. Now, if you'll remember from my House of Chains review, I wasn't the biggest fan of House of Chains, but Midnight Tides, for me, was a step back in the right direction for Erikson. And honestly, guys, this one's really, really good. So let me get straight into it, what I liked and what I didn't like, and just everything in between. Now, I've changed up my format just a little bit, because previously I would just go over basically generally what happened in every section part by part, and I would have like extensive notes about every character. I'm not doing that anymore. If you guys would like me to change back to that format, please let me know. But I've decided to just kind of more do a review in the sense of, hey, this is how this section made me feel, this is how this character made me feel, these are my thoughts on the philosophy or the relationship that these characters have. It's not like a, hey, this is what happened in this book anymore, but more of me just trying to reflect, hey, this is what this book made me feel, this is what these characters made me feel, and this is what I thought overall, good and bad. So if that's cool for you guys, then I'm going to continue with that format. So let me get just straight into it, no more beating around the bush. All right, so part one, Frozen Blood, is kind of a lot of setup for this entire book, because from what I understand, Midnight Tides takes place 3 to 4 years before the Siege of Pale. So this is kind of a prequel to everything that we have read up to this point, excluding like the Memories of Ice prologue, which was like 100,000 years in the past or something crazy like that. That's probably the furthest back we've been. But if Memories of Ice prologue is the furthest back we've been, then, you know, Midnight Tides part one is probably like somewhere way up here, but it's pretty far back, right? And this entire book is set in the past. But this entire first section is a lot of setup, because we have to understand who the Tist Edor are and who their enemies are, who are the Lethri. So this is a lot of setup, and it's not the most exciting stuff we've ever read in Malazan up to this point, right? But there is something that Erikson does with his setup and his dialogue that is, in my opinion, just so well thought out, because there are a lot of fantasy authors out there who will give you lore and world building, and, you know, they'll talk about the history of a race. And to be honest, it can be really boring. Learning about history in a fantasy setting, if you are not a good author, can be really boring. But this dialogue that we kind of open up about the history of the Edor with both part one and the prologue, which kind of sets up a major part of the conflict in the story, to me is really interesting, because Erikson just knows, probably because he's an archaeologist, how to write history in an interesting way. And just having these characters come together and be like, yeah, we're a fallen people, you know, we used to be this incredible empire, or at least incredibly strong race of people, and we've kind of fallen into this like ritualistic tradition of being smacked around by the Lethri, which is a human race, and they should be weaker than us. And we've just fallen so far from where we used to be, you know. however many thousands of years ago, is very interesting to me. I also think that this part where we are introduced to Tejo and Bug, um, I'm just gonna be honest, Tejo and Bug are probably the greatest comedic duo that Erikson has ever created. I mean, these two are so funny. And I apologize if I bounce around from subject to subject, but I have a few notes about what I thought of each part, so I'm just trying to remember. But Tejo and Bug, their entire story throughout this, which I'll get into, is very, very good. Tejo is very interesting to me because he is this man who seems on the surface to be like incredibly lazy, but is actually like he's stupid smart. Like he is so smart that he could bring about the entire collapse of his own civilization through leveraging funds, basically. I mean, I think that Erikson was trying to make the Lethri basically a proto-capitalist society where money is the most important thing ever, if I understand what he's writing correctly. And Tejo is kind of this incredibly smart socialist, if we're putting it plainly. And, some of that conversation happens later in the book. But, he sees that his society is failing the most poor-off people, that most people who aren't rich or who aren't driven by greed are left behind. And he's so smart that he can basically bring down that entire system by himself through capitalistic means. So like buying out companies, shelling out companies, all sorts of stuff. And honestly, this entire plot line is really fun to watch, especially if you're like, if you're a fan of just genuinely very intelligent characters who have a decent moral code. This is pretty fun. Plus, every interaction between him and Bug is just hysterical, and the Bug reveal for who he actually is really, really cool. I will say, though, that besides Tejo and Bug, the most interesting character in this entire story is probably Troll, who we are introduced to in House of Chains, but he is so much better here than he was in House of Chains, probably because we get to spend more time with him. It's kind of, more than anyone, it's kind of Troll's story in this and his people's story by extension, because we already know him from House of Chains, but now he's a younger man, and, it's very interesting to see the change he goes through, because this story, like if you had to narrow it down to what it's about two groups of brothers. First is the Edward brothers, which are Fear, Troll, and Rulad, and there's another one whose name I always forget. And then there are the Benedict brothers, who are Tejo, and the other two, who I'm not going to remember because I didn't write down their names. But this book is very much about brotherhood. Part two, we then transition to part two, and while I said and thought that part one was kind of boring and it was a lot of setup, part two is where this book really finds its footing, and it just goes for it because it's a huge step up in terms of action and plot. We see a lot of things that happen, and I tried writing what it was and breaking it down. So again, I'm going off mostly memory and what I wrote down, like my very scattered notes, so please forgive me if I forget anything. I'm trying to do different formats, but first of all, we get more Troll. Troll and his brothers are attacked by what I believe are Soul Taken. They might be diverse, but I believe they're Soul Taken, and this is where Rulad dies. Now, obviously, if you're watching this video, you've probably read Midnight Tides. And if you, for some reason, haven't read Midnight Tides and want to watch this video, I don't recommend that because I'm going to be talking about spoilers. So probably click off the video now. But Rulad dies here for the first time. And, this is really interesting because Rulad is, out of his brothers, he's probably the least capable. Like, when you actually think about it, Fear is this great, strong, silent warrior, and, for all of his kind of questioning of his society, Troll is also a very great warrior, and he's kind of talked up about how great he is with the spear. And then there's Roulat, who is this unblooded dude who is kind of like the peacock of the family. He's all about strutting around. He's all about flexing on people, but he's actually never done anything a day in his life, right? So he finally goes out with his brothers and gets blooded, and then he dies. And then the Cripple God, the main antagonist in this entire series, decides to resurrect him. And he does that by using the power of this sword, which is like this giant like slab of iron or something like that. It's really cool. Like it's really, really cool. And what I think is so interesting about how Erikson paints this picture is that sometimes in fantasy, we see a character resurrected and they just come back perfectly fine. But Erikson doesn't do that. He does the thing where he's like, yeah, guess what? Being resurrected, it actually sucks. Because Rulag goes through this, his body goes through this entire ceremony of the Tist Edor ceremony, where they essentially, from what I understand, melt gold coins onto his skin, and they do it on his eyes, and I think he had like his throat cut when he was killed. So he comes back to life, and he's like this haggard mess of like, he's like Frankenstein's monster. You know what I mean? Like, he comes back to life and he's just like in extreme pain because he has these hot coins fused into his skin, and they're being seared into his skin. And honestly, the whole thing is nuts because he's like laying there, and then he just wakes up and he just screams, and it's really messed up. It's actually a really messed up sequence, but I think Erikson paints a really good picture of, hey, guess what? Magic isn't always a good thing. Coming back to life isn't always a good thing. And doing this entire thing will drive you nuts. Power is not worth suffering for. On the other hand, we get Mortejo and Bug. And they have this girl who is dead. And I think, if I understand correctly, she was cursed at some point in her life, and then she was killed. And then, she was hired out by Tehol, and her name is Shirk. And Shirk, in order to not look like a dead person, and this is really funny. This is either really funny or it's really messed up. I guess it depends on your perspective. But they give her this parasite that is driven by sex, and they put it in her in order to make her feel alive again, and it leads her to just sleeping with anything that moves. I mean, she is just trying to break into houses and sleeping with like priests and stuff, and honestly, the entire sequence is really fun. But yeah, like, they have an entire plot line with that going on, but I kind of want to get more back to Rulad because he's a problem. He's a problem is the best way I can say it, because Rulad, having come back to life, is also somewhat, he's not really possessed by the crippled god, but he is heavily influenced by him to say certain things and do certain things. So Rulad Sengar, he comes back to life, and he calls out, let's see, I think his name's something Mosag, the former emperor, or the former king of the Tist Edo people. And he's like, guess what, dude? I know the crippled god had a meeting with you. I know that you were working for him, but I'm actually the Cripple God's #1 guy now. So I'm going to ascend to Emperor, and everybody in this room is going to bow down to me. And I'm going to be incredibly, incredibly cruel. And, I hate rooting for anyone who is under the Cripple God's influence. But Rulad really is a character you love to hate. Like, this dude he's completely nuts. He is incredibly cruel. And despite all these things, it's hard not to like the guy because he is just on demon timing. And it's kind of interesting to see what resurrection does to him, because as you guys know, if you've read the book, it just makes him nuts. Like, every time he dies and he comes back to life, he just goes absolutely crazy, and he becomes more and more cruel. And something I was questioning about myself, or questioning while I was reading this, was, is his cruelty a result of just who he is as a person? Was this always a part of his nature as a character? Or is this more a result of him being resurrected and influenced by the Crippled God? Because from what we know, the Crippled God only cares about pain and suffering. He is taking everything that has happened to him and he's trying to push that out onto other people because he thinks that's the only way existence should work. So yeah, I think this entire section works really well, and it also brings up a lot of great philosophical questions, like, what is the nature of cruelty? Are you cruel? Is part of nature and part of being human, or in this case, Tist Edor, that you are born cruel, or is it your environment that makes you cruel? And I think that's a really great question Erikson puts forth. And I don't know if anyone else kind of thought about it that way, or if anyone has shared my opinions on that, but I do wonder, is Rulad just cruel because he's always been like this, or is it he has gone insane and it's because of the Crippled God's influence, or is it a mix of both? Like, what percentage is what percentage? You know what I mean? And then we move on to part 3, which is just it's insane. Rulad declares war on the Lethri, and the Lethri invade the Tist Edor home, and it doesn't go well for them because the Lethri have one thing the Tist Edor don't, and that is incredibly powerful mages. So they unleash all of their warrens and just hammer their home. But the thing is, the Tist Edor, they aren't home. They're out in the woods. They're out in the woods camping, and they're hiding, and they're spawn killing. So the Tist Edor kind of counterattack because now they know where they are. They unleash their own magic of some sort, and this entire sequence is just entirely bloody. It's just, you see an entire town get razed, and then you see the Tist Edor basically counterattack and kill all these magicians / warren users, whatever you want to call them. And it just, the mages get screwed. And then the Tist Edor go one step further, and they invade Lethri. And they just completely steamroll the Lethri people, because from what I understand, the Lethri people are all about offense, no defense. All offense, no defense. So when the Tist Edor show up in their ships and start invading, everybody's like, this isn't going well for us. So, it's just kind of funny to see. This is also probably the section so far in the series, out of any section, that Erikson is really commenting on his own philosophical and political beliefs. between, Memories of Ice had that philosophical musing of what is compassion. Every book has its own kind of theme and what it's going for and what Erikson is trying to portray. Memories of Ice is compassion, Dead House Gates is duty, compassion, those kinds of things. House of Chains is sisterhood and duality and, kind of duty, but also what it means for change and what it means to just be able to forgive people or give them, peace, what it means to give someone solace. But this book, or at least the Tehol and Bug parts, are very much, I think, Erikson kind of musing on, is capitalism or a system like capitalism really that good for the average person? Can we not figure out a system that works for the common man better? Because obviously it is at least his belief that this system where we put money over people has not historically worked out for the majority of people, except those who have gotten lucky, or those who have somehow cheated the system hard enough to have become rich. And he really he kind of puts that question forward, but I don't know if he ever actually answers it necessarily because of the Tisk Edor stuff and how they invade. So I don't know if that's a question he's going to answer in Reaper's Gale or not, but I'm interested to see what he thinks beyond, hey, this system bad. You know what I mean? Like, what is the solution beyond just saying, hey, the system's messed up? So yeah, I really like the philosophical and political musings in this. And it has me interested to see if this is something he's going to continue to commentate on or not. And then we get to the final part. And the final part, frankly, is probably the best part, because so much happens here. And this is entirely based on memory, so I'm definitely going to skip some parts. First of all, we realize that Rulad is the one who flooded the war, and that we've seen in Dead House Gates and House of Chains. It's the fragment of Kurad Emerlon or something like that, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It's one of the Darkness, the Warrens of Darkness fragments or something like that. We also just see a ton of different stuff here. Tehol gets beat up and beat down by a bunch of Tisk Edor, and this is where we're shown that Bug is actually a god. He is the god of the sea or something like that, and there's been hints throughout the entire book that, hey, Bug is more than meets the eye, and you kind of get that vibe from him, but you don't exactly know what that means until the end. There's also, I think the biggest part, and now I finally remembered one of the brothers' names. Bryce fights Rulad, and Bryce actually kills Rulad because he's this great warrior, but then Bryce dies to poison, which is the only way they could beat him. And then Rulad, having been killed, or at least, no, not killed, but he was crippled, having been severely crippled, is laying on the floor. And this is really kind of the pivotal moment in this book for me, is he's there with his two brothers, Fear and Troll. And Fear realizes that he just can't deal with this anymore. Fear has been this incredibly strong, I stand by my brother this entire time. We don't get inside his head at all. And then finally, here it is. This moment of they have to kill their brother in order to have him heal, right? That's how he has to heal. But killing him will make him go more insane, and it will the consequences won't be good, because the Tisk Edor are basically slaves under Rulad, right? but Fear chooses to walk away, while Troll, being the brother who has been very vocal about his opposition against Rulad, is the one who stays, at least for a little bit. And then he follows Fear, and they have this entire conversation of Fear is going out to find Scavendari One Eye. Look at that, I remembered. In order to kind of figure out what happened to Tist Edor, and Troll is talking to him, and he realizes that someone has to keep Rulad in check, and that's going to be him. Of course, we know from House of Chains that didn't work out. He was imprisoned by his own people to suffer in a well for like eternity or something like that. But I don't know, this entire final section was really, really good, and I wish I remembered more of it off the top of my head. But this book, for me, was a huge improvement over House of Chains. I did not love House of Chains. I thought some of the philosophical and I thought the entire plot and the conclusion just didn't really work for me, besides the Karsa Orlong bits. But this here for me was really good. I think the plot is probably the most straightforward we've seen from this series so far, and to me that's a great thing. If somebody wanted to get in this series and they were having a really difficult time with Gardens of the Moon, I might recommend them Midnight Tides, because it's a prequel, number one, and I don't think there's too much in this book that if you read it as your first one, it's going to give away too much of the other books that have come before it, just because of its kind of prequel nature. And its story is super straightforward. There are obviously characters you can root for that are just obvious. And despite it having a slower start compared to Gardens of the Moon, I think it actually works because it's interesting to see the dynamic between two cultures, right? One is the Lethri, who are, at least as the narrative tells us, supposed to be this kind of advanced people who are very forward-thinking. They are driven by success, they are driven by money, they are driven by, reaching that next goal. And then there are the Tist Edor, who are steeped in this kind of old tradition of a bygone era, and, they are not forward-thinking, they're very traditional in their ways, and of course, you realize that it's a facade. Lethri is a facade. It's a decaying and broken society. It's not working for most people. While the Tist Edor, until Rulad takes over, it's not going badly for them. It's not perfect by any means, but this sense of tradition and belonging with the Tist Edor people, it's been working for them until Rulad takes over. And then they don't swap places necessarily, but you see how one culture who's been dominated by tradition up until a point of rebirth can very easily take over one that is forward-thinking but completely internally broken. So I think the plot here is really, really good, especially for people who kind of like to muse on the nature of politics and how certain cultures might be able to take over other cultures just because of their societal beliefs or their lack of societal beliefs. I also think the world building here is probably the closest we've come in this series to a complete and utter living and breathing world. I really like Erikson's world building in all of his books. I think it's very cool. But a lot of it reads kind of like Roman history. Like if you're a fan of Roman history or ancient history like I am, then you kind of know what I mean, where you can see how the Romans, or whatever fantasy culture insert here, influence the modern day events, or how the Malazans are influencing this. But it feels disconnected, because it's like, okay, I understand what's happening, I understand why it's happening, I understand why it's important, but I don't necessarily feel like I'm actually in that world experiencing it. And Midnight Tides is a change to that because, I feel like, and people might disagree with me here, but Erikson kind of tells a story in a way it's like an epic saga. It's kind of like reading the Iliad, you know what I mean? Where you have these characters that you love, but you don't necessarily feel connected to them because it feels like it's a bygone era that you just can't quite, there's like some sort of block there, at least for me. But this is the first book where I was really like, I feel completely connected because I have been following these characters and only these characters, and it's such a self-isolated story, and you feel everything that the Edor feel, especially Troll, who is probably the major point of view character in this book. If there is one, it's probably him. And you really get to experience what the Tist Edor culture is like and what it's like to be raised in the society. And on the flip side, you get the same thing with Tehol, who, and his companions, who show you what it's like to be Lethri and how much it probably actually sucks to be both. So I just think there is a real connection to the environment, which has been kind of missing compared to the previous books. And I think that Edor and Lethri are both just really interesting cultures to follow because they're so diametrically opposed. I feel like the Malazans, as much as I really genuinely do love the Malazans, they are kind of hard to follow because they're an empire, and an empire does not have a singular culture. That is just not how empires work, and the same can be said of following the Seven Cities, because the Seven Cities have a general cultural overview, but they have very different ideas of what that culture looks like, and then there's people opposed to that cultural idea, and all sorts of stuff like that. So I think the world building here works really, really, really well. I think it's very well done. The characters here are probably the best overall so far. I'm not going to say that they are my favorite, but I think Erikson's character writing in this book is the best it's been compared to all the others, because Rulad is very interesting. He is a heartbreaking character to follow. I hate this guy, but I also love him because he just suffers, and he suffers for what feels like no reason. I mean, there is a reason, but he is just suffering on his own, and he's slowly going insane, and his descent into madness is just really sad to see because, yeah, he was kind of a cocky, just dude who, his brothers didn't quite respect, but you see him go through this transformation, and you can't help but feel bad for the guy. And then there's Troll, who is just this incredibly he's a character who understands himself. He understands himself and his place in his culture, and he understands his culture very well. And I just think the Sengar brothers in general, Fear included, are all very interesting to follow. I know there's a fourth one, but I can't remember his name, and no one else can either, And it's just an interesting contrast to see, because Fear is, the silent leader type who, people follow not because he's someone who's peacocking or straying around and saying, oh, look at me, man. He's not talking the talk, but he's walking the walk, you know what I mean? His actions speak for themselves. And then there's Troll, who is he's reserved. People respect him, but he's very outspoken about, hey, this is what I think is wrong with our society. And he has the integrity to say, I'm not just going to stand here and agree with my brother because he's my brother or because he's the most powerful Edor of all time. I'm going to say, hey, I think it's actually messed up to try and conquer another people. I think that this entire thing is being organized by someone who isn't my brother. I think there's somebody behind him. And then there's, of course, Rulad, who I spoke about, who his entire arc of suffering is just really, really interesting to see. And then there's Tehol and Bug, who are just they're the perfect comedic duo. I mean, they're both hysterical, but it's also really interesting to see two characters who are played for laughs, who are also very good at what they do. Because Tehol and Bug basically arrange it throughout this entire story to have their society collapse because they don't agree with how it's working out until the Edor arrive, and that messes things up for them, obviously. And then there's Bryce, who is the other Benedict brother, and I know there's another one who ends up working for the Edor, but I'm completely blanking on his name right now. But it's interesting to see how Erikson uses these two sets of brothers to not only contrast one another as sets of brothers, but also just internally contrast, like how different Roulad is from Fear, and how different Fear is from Troll, and how different Tehol is from Bryce, and Bryce from the other brother whose name I seriously cannot remember. But yeah, I think the character work is the best it's been up to this point. Although I am like over halfway through the Bone Hunters, and I will say I think it's even better in the Bone Hunters, so just putting that out there as a warning. I might go over this again. The dialogue in this book, to the surprise of literally no one, it's good. I mean, Erikson just knows how to write dialogue. There's commentary in here, there's comedy in here, just the way that characters interact feels very real. It feels like they've known each other for as long as they've known each other. It never feels awkward or weird or like not convincing, I suppose. So the dialogue here, it's very good. I mean, it's probably, again, the best we've gotten in this series so far. And then of course there's the action. And I think Erikson, genuinely, I said this, I think in my short review, that Erikson writes the best action in the genre, like bar none. I really think that he just is able to do it in such a he can do grounded action, and he can do really over the top action, and he can do everything in between, right? You know, when there's a sword fight, it's really intriguing, but when there's a magic fight, it's also really intriguing. So I don't think I have to go on and on, but the action is like very, very good. I think it's very creative, and I think it's the best stuff you can read in the genre. If literally nothing else, people should read Malazan for how good the action is. It's very detailed. It's not necessarily easy to envision at times, especially when the Warrens come out to play, but it is really, really fun to see. You know, like there's an entire scene in this book where a crippled wizard king uses the son and wife of the Lethri king as a conduit for power during a mage fight. And I mean, if that isn't like the most metal thing you've ever heard, I don't know what else to say. I mean, the action is always good, and it always serves a purpose. It's never just gratuitous for gratuitous sake or action for action's sake. It's always very well done. So my overall thoughts for Midnight Tides are this. It's a huge step up from House of Chains, which I didn't enjoy as much as I wanted to. I think on a reread I will, because Bone Hunters is making me retroactively think about House of Chains, which is a good thing. The first act in this book, however, is a little slow. It's a little plodding. There's a lot of buildup. But after that, if you can get through the first act, you're in for a really good time, because this book is firing on all cylinders. The characters are great, the action is great, the world building is great, the dialogue is great, the plot itself is absolutely wonderful. If we're just talking front to back, favorite plot, as in, you know, what happened from point A to point Z, Midnight Tides might be my favorite. Memories of Ice is my favorite Malazan book, but if we're talking strictly plot, and maybe even strictly characters, or how well they're written, I think Midnight Tides has the best characters and the best plot, and it also might have the best dialogue. I think everything is well executed in this book. There are no, besides maybe the first part, which is just a little slow, I don't think there are any serious flaws in this book. It's not my favorite in this series, but it is very, very, very well done. It is a very good fantasy book, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who is interested in reading it. Obviously, I gave away a bunch of spoilers, and somebody new to this series shouldn't be watching the Midnight Tides in-depth review. But if for some reason you have seen this and you're looking into it, and I didn't give too much away for it to ruin the book for you, just read it. This book's really, really good. I think I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. It might be higher than that. It might be more like an 8.8 the more I think about it. I might have to retroactively give it an 8.8 out of 10 because this book it's very good. The more I'm thinking about it, the more I like it. So yeah, this book is awesome. It's got everything going for it. So that is my Midnight Tides in-depth review. I hope you guys enjoy. If you like this new format where I just kind of skip around and talk about what I like and the parts I remember and all of that, please let me know. If you prefer the other format where I go more in depth about each point, just let me know. I mean, whatever you guys prefer, I'll adjust to. If you have another style that you would like to see, just let me know. And hopefully we can have a good conversation down in the comments. Tell me your favorite part about Midnight Tides.